New numbers from a Harvard-Harris poll show President Biden's approval rating sits at 62%. That is the highest mark for his administration so far. His disapproval rating also reached a new low of 38%. The same poll also shows 47% of Americans believe the country is on the right track. Back in January, just 27% said the country was headed in the right direction. So Joe Biden banking some good numbers here in his presidency.
There's just such dissonance here. We sit here and maybe...
Well, you look what's going on in Texas overnight.
Well, maybe we're majoring on the minor here, or maybe these, you look at these and go, well, are these polls wrong? Like, the Wisconsin poll and some of the other polls, state polls that were wrong. But Jonathan Lemire, I mean, the national polls weren't like 20 points off. I mean, if you look at it, the national polls weren't that far off. It's usually the state polls that are outliers. And I'm just looking at, 62-38. We've seen quite a few up in the 60s. There's some, of course, in the 50s. There's a varying degree, but every one of them's over 50%. And this right track, wrong track number from this Harvard-Harris poll has jumped nearly 20 points. I'm a skeptic. I beat the crowd early and tweeted. I probably back in early October of last year. I don't believe any polls, and I didn't believe any of those polls that were saying Biden was so far ahead. But in this case, then, but in this case, though, something's happening out there that seems to be quite different than what the House GOP caucus is thinking or doing.
Yeah, Joe, certainly you and I have had our share of poll skepticism, and I think you're right to focus on the right track, wrong track numbers. And these are big picture things, and we haven't seen the nation feel this good about itself in a long time. And I think, and that of course reflects what we're also seeing is very good numbers for President Biden. In a range somewhere between the low 50s and now this one 62, which is a pretty remarkable number. And all of these much higher than his predecessor ever obtained in any poll during his time. And I think the big picture stuff, as we know, is there's a sense of optimism. The vaccine rollout has been so successful. And, we have seen Americans now, more than 50% of adult Americans have been fully vaccinated, and the White House is on track to reach its goal of 70% of adult Americans having at least one shot by our next patriotic holiday, July 4th. The economy is showing signs of reopening. It's up fits and starts, and there's still questions as to what further federal intervention the economy needs, to be sure. But those are the big things, a sense of normalcy, a sense the country is starting to look like it was again pre-pandemic, and not just in terms of the virus, but also, of course, in terms of some of the leadership from the White House. And that's something the West Wing aides have been really zeroed in on during the campaign, and now certainly during the first few months of the Biden administration, that America was just sort of tired at the end of the Trump administration. It was looking to think less about the president, to have more of a sense of regular order, if you will, coming from the White House. And an event like yesterday, I think, underscores that. I'm in Wilmington, Delaware today, and have been all weekend on pool duty with the president. I was there yesterday for his Memorial Day weekend remarks. And to hear him speak so movingly about the sacrifices of American servicemen and their families, to stand there in the rain for more than an hour listening to other tributes, to make it so deeply personal as he reflected upon the loss of his son, Beau Biden, who was a veteran who died 6 years ago yesterday. So it was a tough, difficult day, that anniversary for the Biden family, and he connected it to the larger sacrifices of the American servicemen and saying the people as they reflect the best of a nation that's on its way back. And to hear that message from the White House is one that I think also is resonating with Americans. We're seeing it in those polls.
And Joe, just to frame something Jonathan Lemire said, getting Americans to think less about the presidency, the fire hose of news coming toward Americans during the Trump presidency was just tons of gripping negativity and fighting and sort of a very different attitude coming from the White House. Maybe Americans get a break. They think less about the presidency, not a bad thing. But when they do tune in and see what he's doing something like this, which is a big difference for everybody in America.
And you know what people can do when they tune in and they see a president doing what a president is supposed to be doing.
Honoring people.
Honoring people, not talking about himself, not making controversial statements. You know what they can do? They can sit there They can look at it and smile, and then they can turn over to the ball game. It's the return to
He's doing his
normalcy.
job.
You know, again, we just don't know how much to trust these polls, Eddie. But I remember talking to so many of people who were supporting Donald and saying, he just exhausts me.
Yeah.
He just, every day, I don't want to talk about it at dinner. I don't want to talk about it at breakfast. I don't want to talk about it when I'm golfing the whole 18 rounds. I don't want to talk about it when I'm fishing. I don't want to talk about it when I'm hunting. I don't want to talk about it. Okay, I'm voting for him. I don't want to talk about it all the time, right? And I was hearing that from people that voted for Donald Trump twice. Well, what in the world has happened since the election? The madness has gotten even more intense. And, you know, in certain circles, people are talking about it more. And there is just a sheer exhaustion. It's, you know, I'm the wrong person to deliver this message since we're hosts of a 3-hour show, Mika and I, about politics. But, I mean, it's not good for this country to be talking about politics 24 hours. Say that's not who we are.
Fighting about it.
Well, or even talking about politics, obsessing about politics. People looking at MSNBC or Fox 24 hours a day or CNN 24 hours a day. I feel like, you know, then to Ferris Bueller, what are you still doing here? Go out, like do something, get out, you know. And Donald Trump had people talking about Donald Trump, including us, 24 hours a day. I think this return to normalcy, it cannot be overstated. And you look at these high numbers and the right track. I just wonder, Eddie, if that's one of the things that are pushing these numbers up.
I think, Joe, I think you're right in this sense, right? That we cannot underestimate the importance of competence and, in some ways, the displacement of spectacle. Under the Trump administration, every single day, as you rightly described, we were dealing with the circus and P.T. Barnum. And our politics felt that way, right? And there's this sense in which the seams of the country were coming undone. And there was this intensity. And then you combine that with the reality of COVID-19, its devastation. So, and of course, incompetence was on display every single day. So we cannot downplay the comfort that some of us feel in the country, that government is actually working, or at least trying to work, that competence is actually at the helm. But at the same time, I want us to be mindful, even as we kind of make this shift, that Memorial Day is a day in which we acknowledge those who sacrificed their lives. We're acknowledging our dead, those who have made this moment of comfort possible. And that this Memorial Day is also part of a kind of broader recognition that millions of Americans are dealing with anniversaries of their dead, people who have lost their lives because of COVID. And then you combine that with the statistic, Joe. I think the recent poll said that 56% of Republicans believe that the election was rigged and 53% believe that Donald Trump is still president or something like that. We know that there are deep divisions. Yeah. We have to assert unity. But we also need to understand that the country stands in some ways on a knife's edge, and that this particular feeling, we need to kind of figure out how to sustain it over time in light of the contradictions that define our current day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I will say when that 53% becomes 47%, 46%, and it's moving in that direction, then I think we can breathe a little bit easier. It is important to remember if it's 53% of Republicans who believe that, that's like 25, 30% of the overall population. And so I'm not saying that's great. I'm just saying we may be moving in a good direction. I'll just say, Mika, you just look at what we talk about. Look what Washington's in a heated debate about right now. And instead of having a president calling for the imminent arrest of his political opponent 2 weeks before the election and pressuring his attorney general to put him into jail, or to call a news host of a TV show a murderer 12 times and to try to get him sent to jail, or to be saying that, you know, you trust Vladimir Putin more than you trust your own intel community, that the heads of which you saw. I mean, instead of that, we're talking right now about, we're complaining about deficits about debt. People are coming on talking about inflationary pressures that are being from big spending, that we may have inflation coming up even more. We're talking about those sort of things. And again, there is that return to normalcy. Now, there still are Republicans that are still trying to talk about, as Eddie said, how the seams of this republic are being ripped apart.
Yeah.
Most Americans just aren't buying that. And right now, at least, they're in a bubble talking to themselves.
Yeah, no, I appreciate what you're trying to sort of figure out what this moment feels like, and this relief almost from the tension of the past 4 years. And to Eddie's point, I think people are taking comfort in what appears to be a normally functioning administration, even if they didn't vote for Joe Biden. And I think he is achieving his goal to try and be a president to all people, even those who didn't vote for him.